My name is Lina, and I'm a research intern for SASA. In this video, I'm going to talk about how the way we teach ancient languages has a huge impact on the accessibility of ancient studies disciplines as a whole. So, a little bit about me. I love archaeology, and I'm in the process, or starting the process, of applying to PhD programs in ancient Greek and Roman archaeology. But my interest in the ancient world and in archaeology didn't start with a burning desire to dig holes in the dirt. It really started with languages. I started learning Latin in 4th grade and kept studying Latin all the way through high school and ended up getting a degree in classics, which means I studied Latin and ancient Greek, primarily alongside sort of history and literature of those cultures. And my acquaintance with languages has really prepared me to be excited about archaeology and be ready to study it at a higher level. And languages are really, really important for any kind of advanced study of the ancient world, because if you can't understand the people you're studying in their own languages, you're really limited in what you can do. The way ancient languages are taught and the way we conceptualize how we learn those languages and what the purpose of learning those languages is, it makes a huge difference in the kinds of students who are invited and encouraged to be a part of those learning environments. I'm not alone in the fact that studying ancient languages did a lot to jumpstart my interest in studying the ancient world more broadly. So it's incumbent upon us, as people who want other people to be excited about the ancient world, to think really seriously about the way we teach ancient languages and whether the way we do that makes those languages accessible to everybody. If you studied Latin in high school, you probably did that because someone told you it would make your college applications look really good, or it would make you smarter, or expand your vocabulary, or make your SAT score higher, or better prepare you for a career as a doctor or a lawyer. Latin and ancient Greek have a reputation as languages that are for smart kids. And a lot of that perception and a lot of that messaging has to do with the way these languages are taught. The vast majority of the time when you learn a language like Latin or ancient Greek, you're going to learn it through what's called the grammar and translation approach. And this method is sort of predicated on the idea that if you learn all the discrete parts of the language, if you learn all the vocabulary, if you learn all the grammar, if you learn all the different sort of things, nouns and verbs and adjectives and everything else can do, then you can put them all together like a puzzle and magically be able to read any text that's in front of you. This might sound innocuous and maybe even efficient, but we're finding more and more that this approach is really underpinned by elitism and exclusionary attitudes. In his article, Why Students of Color Don't Take Latin, John Bracey writes, quote, "This approach generally consists of learning grammar rules, learning grammar terminology, memorizing paradigms, and translating Latin into English primarily to demonstrate grammatical accuracy. When you boil it down, the emphasis is on memorization and application of abstract grammatical formulae. This approach takes a language that was once spoken comfortably by people of all backgrounds, social classes, ages, etc. throughout the world and renders it into a complex linguistic jigsaw puzzle that requires an elite mathematical mind to decipher." End quote. Students who are perceived as having that kind of elite mathematical mind and who are encouraged to learn Latin, and indeed even have access to Latin in the first place, are more often than not rich and white. The assumptions underlying the grammar translation approach unnecessarily exclude a lot of students from ancient language classrooms. In fact, sometimes this is something that the discipline even prides itself on. In fact, Princeton classics professor Joshua T. Katz, who incidentally has recently been roundly criticized and even denounced by his own department for recent racist remarks, writes on his faculty page on the department's website that his introductory intensive ancient Greek course is reputed to be harder than orgo, with what I suppose is pride. Katz may be an outlier in terms of the openness of his racism, but his apparent pride in the difficulty of his ancient Greek course illuminates some more widespread problems with the discipline. Recent studies have found that classics is among a group of disciplines that places a great deal of value on the trait of brilliance. Placing emphasis on so-called brilliance really means placing value on innate ability, or what is perceived as innate ability. And that's a very nebulous and slippery concept. Our understanding of what brilliance is really reliant on sort of normative ideas about what a smart person is like, how they talk, how they think, the kind of education they've received. And within those prescribed boundaries, you find a really narrow group of people. Those studies I referenced earlier found that the more emphasis a field placed on brilliance as a trait, the fewer women and people of color were in that field. So what do we do? How do we open up fields that require knowledge of ancient languages to more people? How do we make our classrooms more accessible to people regardless of background? Well, it turns out that the grammar and translation approach is not the only way you can learn a language. As it turns out, you can learn a language like Latin or ancient Greek far more naturally than the grammar and translation approach would have you believe. Another method of language instruction is gaining popularity among teachers of Latin. In fact, if you've learned a modern language, you may already be familiar with it. This method is called comprehensible input, and it doesn't require a systematic knowledge of grammatical forms and structures. Rather, you're introduced to the language more naturally through speech and text that's just above whatever level you're starting out at, so that even if you don't know necessarily all the vocabulary or all the grammatical structures, you can start to figure it out on your own without having to memorize external scaffolding. You might think of something like the Rosetta Stone language learning method as an example of comprehensible input. Turns out you can get Rosetta Stone in Latin. And they teach you Latin on Rosetta Stone the same way they teach you any other Rosetta Stone language, by introducing you slowly to words and sentences and, inviting you to figure things out on your own. A distinction I think it's really important to emphasize is that while comprehensible input language instruction makes the learning experience easier, it's not dumbing down the content itself. Rather, it's removing barriers to understanding. It eliminates artificial constraints and methods that we find in something like the grammar and translation approach, and makes language learning possible for anyone. It doesn't dumb down the language, it democratizes it. Teaching languages like Latin through comprehensible input means that there's no reason to place barriers on who's allowed in your classroom. If your method of instruction is designed to be accessible to anyone, then there's no reason to restrict language learning just to honors kids or smart kids or kids on the gifted track. Those distinctions don't mean anything if you're teaching language naturally and without artificial difficulty. So maybe you're wondering why, in big picture terms, you should care about the way Latin is taught. The input method can be applied to languages besides Latin and ancient Greek. Any language for which we have a pretty decent understanding of the way the language works, the grammar, the vocabulary, any language that we've reconstructed well enough, we can teach in the same way. Second, teaching Latin inclusively could be a powerful tool for making more people feel like studying the ancient world is something they can do. Of all the ancient languages out there, Latin is the one that people are most familiar with and are introduced to the earliest. If people's introduction to Latin, particularly at the high school level, is positive and inclusive, then perhaps they'll be more likely to want to explore more of what ancient studies has to offer. In the last few minutes of this video, I want to reflect on why it is that Latin is the ancient language that people are most familiar with and learn most often in high school settings. Another reason people are encouraged to learn Latin is because of exceptionalist arguments about so-called classical civilizations, namely Greece and Rome, and their importance in the development of intellectual history and modern civilization as we know it. And of course, more often than not, when people refer sort of generally to modern civilization, what they're really referring to is an incredibly Eurocentric vision of things. A vision that focuses primarily on the Western canon and lets other parts of the puzzle, other parts of the world, other cultures fall by the wayside when we construct our picture of the history of culture and thought. The truth is, the ancient world was just as diverse and complicated as the world we live in right now. And our study of the ancient world should reflect that, both in terms of the cultures we're focused on, the languages we want to learn, and the people we include in our conversations in this discipline. Ancient studies has room for everyone. Given accessible tools and welcoming learning environments, anyone who wants to should be able to become a part of these fields. In much the same way that we've seen that language learning can be for everyone, so too can the broader study of the ancient world include people of all backgrounds and perspectives. Finally, I want to emphasize the extent to which this is so much just the tip of the iceberg in terms of the conversation on diversity in ancient studies fields. Throughout the video, I've included links to articles where you can learn more about specific topics, and I really encourage you to check those out because this is a huge conversation with a lot of different voices, and mine is certainly not the only one that matters or the only one you should be paying attention to. More often than not, we give the greatest credibility to white voices while letting the voices of people of color fall by the wayside. And so throughout this video, many of the links I've included are written by people of color, and so I really encourage you to check them out so that you can get a broader sense of the perspectives that are involved in this huge conversation. That's all for now. Thanks for watching.